in a shorthand, although it may appear long, is because while we speak of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism as being the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition that we have, I agree with that. What is lost by those who may sometimes critique it are three things. Number one, that this is the most representative definition that we have. It was adopted pursuant to a democratic decision-making process over a 15-year period, as I shared with you, adopted by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, academics, and the like. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism is very much anchored in human rights law in general and equality rights law in particular. And as somebody, as I say, who was involved in it, as one of the drafts people and the like, I can tell you that even our thinking on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms helped to underpin the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, such as the equality rights approach that I mentioned earlier. And the third thing, the notion that it silences speech, is to turn both the history and the content of the IRA working definition on its head. It's the other way around. It's intended to protect the speech, for example, of Jewish students and their supporters on the campuses whose speech may be silenced or marginalized or excluded or demonized. At the same time, it protects the speech of those who criticize Israel or who are pro-Palestinian, and it expressly says so in the IRA working definition. And this brings me to that unanimous resolution adopted in the Canadian Parliament. I moved it in February 2015. It's a very significant resolution because it will underpin the National Emergency Summit that is about to take place, and which is not as well known, not as well known, is little known, but is one of the most important principles and precedents that we have with regard to combating anti-Semitism.
So the summit was announced. What is the summit going to look like?
I think the most important thing for the summit is the appreciation of a sense of urgency because of the explosive nature of anti-Semitism that's been described to you. I don't need to, and I issued a statement about it, but the unprecedented explosion in anti-Semitic hate crimes on the one hand, and incendiary hate speech on the social media on the other are two important components. But those two will have to be addressed as part of what I call an overall national action plan to combat anti-Semitism. You know, I have a 10-point action plan. I've already shared it with the government and with the Jewish organizations. I think that can help frame the discussion. That's number one. Number two, I believe it's important that present at this national summit, and I've shared this with the government as well, my views on this, that we need the relevant and responsible ministers to be part of this. In other words, it's important that the Prime Minister be part, but you need to have the Minister of Justice if you want to have an effective strategy with regard to combating hate crimes, etc. You need to have the Minister of Canadian Heritage if you want to have an effective strategy with regard to the incendiary hate speech on social media. You need to have the Foreign Minister there, because we have a whole situation of what I called now for years the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. By that I mean under the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, and the struggle against racism itself. So I think you'd need the Foreign Minister, you'd need the Minister of Public Security there, because we have to ensure that the proper initiatives are being taken, you know, to secure Jews in their communities and in their institutions and the like. So that's one component. I also think that the relevant officials involved in the, not only in these ministries, but from the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which adopted the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism and where it's centered, need to be part of this as well. I've also shared with the government that while I appreciate that we are engaged in Canada, rightly so, and so have I, in combating what has been called systemic racism. That is to say, racism against Indigenous people, BIPOC, Blacks, and people of color. More recently, Asian Canadians. Also, tragedy recently in London, anti-Muslim bigotry. But very often, that approach to systemic racism has left out anti-Semitism. If you look at the speech from the throne, the speech from the throne talked about combating systemic racism. I shared that, but it did not speak about combating anti-Semitism. And that is something that has to, in fact, be addressed as well.
So it's going to be a ministerial meeting on Zoom, or it's going to be in person? And when do we have a deadline? When do we meet? What's the story?
So I've discussed that just as recently as a day ago. It will be on Zoom. And the intention is that it should take place before the end of the month. So if we can get all the parts in place,
and all those B'nai B'rith and all those people are coming too, or it's just ministerial and government?
No. It will be the spectrum of Jewish leadership that will be there. The Jewish organizations, like, for example, CIJA, Simon Wiesenthal, B'nai B'rith, among others, have been advised. I've been in touch with all three of those organizations, not simply now with regard to the announcement, but I maintain ongoing relationships with them. I also think that the people who've been involved, for example, in the Canadian delegation to the IRA conference that I just headed now, should be involved in it too, because we want to benefit from their experience and expertise, because they not only are part of the Canadian delegation, they were made part of the Canadian delegation because they already have a repository of experience and expertise in matters relating to, Holocaust remembrance and education, matters relating to combating anti-Semitism, matters relating to combating Holocaust denial and distortion and the like. So I hope that they will be involved, and it will be the broad spectrum of, Jewish leadership. I would expect, for example, that J Space would be invited to it. My view is that it should be the broad spectrum of Jewish leadership, include the delegation that I mentioned from the IRA, and I think we should get some representatives, young people, students who are themselves the targets of anti-Semitism, and hear their voices as well.
So it's going to be like a one-day thing with different breakout rooms, or is this a continuing series that goes until the end? Like, how do you envision it?
Well, I'm just sharing with you what I've started to share with the government. I don't think it's been thought through yet, to tell you the truth. And now there's also another summit with regard to combating Islamophobia. So there's two summits.
Let's unpack that.
Yeah.
The timing of the anti-Semitism summit, to be frank, was on a Friday afternoon. Hardly anybody knows about it. We were like, what? Why did it get announced in the way that it did without any ministers announcing it? They just tweeted it at like 4 o'clock. It was kind of strange. You announced it. What was that all about?
I didn't announce it. No. I'll tell you what happened here from what I can appreciate. I think that the government was going to announce it, okay? But then, it was announced by the Jewish organizations, and so they basically responded to it as I did. I mean, I didn't announce it. I responded to the announcement made by the Jewish organizations. So, and I think from my understanding from, some of the Jewish organizations, maybe they felt they had to do it because on the same day that they announced it, there was a unanimous motion in Parliament to establish a Muslim national emergency meeting. So I think the kind of intersection was going on here. In other words, let's put it this way. The planning for a national emergency summit has been in the works for some time, but it had not yet neither taken place nor been announced, but it was on the road to happening. I think the tragic murder of the Muslim family in London then elevated the issue of Islamophobia onto the National Emergency Summit #2. And then a question was, a motion was put in Parliament, as I appreciated, read the other one, and therefore all these things then just came out.
So
I
they
think you might
basically
get-
they basically jumped the gun, and you were like, okay, here we go. Let's do ours too.
Something like that.
There's two emergency summits. One, of course, the nation is behind. The other one, which is the Jewish one, is sort of being secondary now because of the tragic incident in London. Not any less important to us, but you know, how do we make these two jibe, or you know, should they be doing it at the same time, or do you think that we should keep it together, one separate from the other?
I think both in this sense. And in other words, I think each has to have its own distinguishable national summit. I think the one with regard to the anti-Semitism has been in the works for some time because of this growing felt sense of urgency, which reached a tipping point with regard to the war. But frankly, it was there before. And when I shared with you that resolution from February 2015, it's an illustration that already then there were those of us who felt that it had to be a priority in both our domestic and foreign policy, and it was so adopted by a unanimous resolution. I think the murder of the Muslim family evoked a reaction amongst the Muslim community, understandably, that they wanted as well a summit, and therefore they got a resolution passed on Friday, which mirrored the resolution that we had in 2015.
What do you want to come out of this national summit? What are you looking for the Jews? What are you looking for specifically?
What I would like to see come out is a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism that is clear in its objectives and in its strategy for implementation. In other words, we don't need another discussion. We don't need another seminar or forum. We need an urgent summit in order to act. And so what must come out of this has to be, an implementation of an action plan. So it would mean that if you want to combat anti-Semitic hate crimes, then the Minister of Justice and the relevant, and I say this as a former, Minister of Justice and Attorney General, has to work together with the other relevant ministers, Minister of Public Security, and produce an action plan. I think you need, B'nai B'rith in their 8-point plan did make some good suggestions on that issue. And in fact, if you go back to the time I was Minister of Justice, I then proposed a national justice initiative against racism and hate, of which one of the objectives then was the combating of anti-Semitic hate crimes. Regrettably, we weren't there long enough as a government to start to put that thing in place, but some of that framing is still there and can still be acted upon. So we need to do this thing. I think the issue with regard to the hate on the social media, when you have a situation of 17,000 tweets in 1 week, variations on Hitler was right, and I can go on to some of the other things, it tells you something about the explosive, incendiary character of the social media. And we've seen how, online hate leads to, offline criminality. So I'm just using those two things as illustrations, but I can, there are other components in that plan that will have to be adopted, including, the imperative at this point of education with regard to not only Holocaust remembrance, but about anti-Semitism. The Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil. Anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. There's an intersection between the two. And when you have a situation that 50% of millennials have never, can't name one concentration camp, and another 50% don't even know what anti-Semitism is, then you have a serious situation with regard to creating awareness and understanding, and as I say, for the purposes of acting upon anti-Semitism. There's a whole series of actions that have to be taken. I don't want to bore or burden you with it, but as I said, I've got this 10-point action plan.
Look, everybody in the Jewish world knows what to do about anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith has talked about it. There's the stophate.ca. There's the online campaign that CJ's doing. We all know what the answer is. So what is the summit going to do? It's just going to get national attention of the politicians to take it seriously finally and hurry up, right? Basically?
No, more than that. It has to actually translate into concrete action. It must translate into proper legislative initiatives, proper law enforcement, etc. So it has to be, as I say, an action plan, not another framing issue.
So like they adopted IRA, that's nice, but they have to actually do something about it. Basically, these are the kinds of things, right?
Yeah, IRA has to be not only adopted, but that you'll see that in the action plan. IRA has to be implemented. It has to be mainstreamed across all levels of society. So I think the IRA working definition is not only the gold standard, but has been democratically adopted, is the most international one that we have, and we should move to mainstream it and implement it right across the board. By the way, in addition to the IRA definition, when I was Minister of Justice, etc., I felt that there was 4 components or 5 components of the new anti-Semitism that were underappreciated. You know, not even all these metrics are in the IRA working definition. So the IRA working definition is illustrative, it's comprehensive, but it doesn't mean that there are not other examples. And I'll just, in one-liners, tell you, one of the things that we've seen recently, what the tipping point with regard to explosion of anti-Semitism has been, one, the danger of what I call, and have called since 2000, genocidal anti-Semitism. These are not words that I use lightly or easily. I'm referring here to the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and instrumentalized in the targeting and terrorizing of Jews under the rubric of genocidal anti-Semitism. The second is what I call demonological anti-Semitism. Here's a perfect example where the old and new anti-Semitisms converge. The old anti-Semitism was to see the Jews as the enemy of all that is good and the repository of all that is evil. The new anti-Semitism is to see Israel and the Jewish people, Israel as the collective Jew among the nations, as the enemy of all that is good and the repository of all that is evil. And therefore, at one and the same time, you find Israel and the Jewish people being referred to as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. And by the way, when I take all these demonological things, they've all been used in the last few weeks alone. So there's this phenomenon of demonological anti-Semitism that even goes beyond, you know, the illustrations in the IRA working definition, which is understated with regard to the demonological part. The third is what I call political anti-Semitism. Very quickly, because this has 4 components. It's denial of Israel's right to exist, denial of its legitimacy, denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, denial even that the Jews are a people. So you have 4 components of political anti-Semitism. And then a 4th dimension of anti-Semitism, the new one, is the terrorist targeting of Jews because they are Jews, whether this is in Israel or whether this is internationally, and even the incentivizing of those attacks, as in the crude pay for slay that has been underway now for some time, and this not under Hamas, but under the Palestinian Authority. And then the last part, which is very often ignored, and I think this is a very important component, particularly for us as Canadians, is what I call and refer to as the laundering of anti-Semitism and the universal public values. In other words, as Canadians, the UN is part of our DNA. It's a centerpiece of our identity, of our foreign policy. So when you have the systematic singling out of Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment, this has a feedback effect into the Canadian political culture, and it feeds into that demonological part, etc. So I think that as Canadians who care about the integrity of the UN, of the integrity of human rights and international law, have to combat this selective singling out of Israel and the Jewish people, as I say, for selective opprobrium and indictment. I'll give you two examples just in the last few weeks alone. Astonishing, where the World Health Organization held that Israel is the only violator of health rights in the world. I repeat, the only violator of health rights in the world.
Well, I never heard that. That's insane.
That's insane, but that's a part of the international record. I can go on, but I don't want to be where, for example, the UN Commission on Women's Rights held that Israel is the only violator of women's rights in the world. Now, you know, if you're a law student, you're being taught these things as part of the general teaching, about decision making in the international arena. I've only given you two examples. I'll give you many more.
What was the worst anti-Semitism thing you personally ever experienced in your life?
It's hard to say. I have child memories whereby I was beaten up, by young gangs who, targeted us in our neighborhoods. That was one. I have that terrible memory, of being with my father as a very, very young person when he almost didn't want to point it out to me. It said, "No dogs, no Jews allowed." And I remember this thing back in the late 40s and so on. And, it's a very funny thing. I'm sorry, because we could talk forever, but let me just close with this thing maybe, is that I was born on May 8th, 1940, okay? On May 8th, 1945 was VE Day. It was the day the war ended in Europe. And it was a great day, international celebration, and in my own household. I don't think I ever saw my father, my parents, and we were living with my grandparents who were from Europe, so happy. It was like a real day of celebration. And my father saying to me, "This is going to be the happiest birthday you ever had." But I started to learn afterwards what happened between May 8, 1940 and 1945. So I began to learn about, horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. And then I began to learn what happened even before I was born. I began to learn that Dachau was actually established in 1933, that the Nuremberg race laws were in 1935, that Kristallnacht was 1938. So what I learned from all that was the dangers of indifference and inaction, when the first serious echoes of anti-Semitism begin. And I regard what is happening now as echoes of the 30s.